There's a good chance that your favourite game of all time released over the past 10 years. However, while the decade has seen a lot of franchises, genres, and studios blossom, it also opened up the floodgates on utter dreck that ended up washed on the shores of Steam and the major consoles. What's worse than an outright terrible game, though, is a disappointing one. A title that you had such high hopes for, were salivating over the pre-release trailers for, but which ultimately fell well short of the mark. They might not have been outright bad per se, but they certainly weren't the masterpieces we were all expecting, though in some cases, yeah, they totally were just plain old bad. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are the 15 most disappointing video games of the decade. Number 15, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. We should not have had high hopes for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 after Activision drove the franchise into the ground via terrible peripheral-based spin-offs. But this sequel was supposed to be a return to form, proof the company still respected the franchise. Spoilers, it absolutely was not. Despite returning to a classic franchise that hadn't received a sequel in over a decade, this follow-up was a cash grab in every single way. A soulless, broken product that wanted to ka-ching in on the affection and nostalgia fans had for the older games without actually putting in the effort to earn it. Number 14, Anthem. There will no doubt be people in the comments saying that Anthem can't be considered a disappointment because everyone knew it was supposed to be bad. But even if that's true, it still ended up being more disappointing because it was somehow even worse than the most pessimistic onlookers guessed before launch. Essentially, it was a looter-shooter without any loot. A hobbled-together disaster that, if reports from sources inside the studio are to be believed, was essentially crafted in a mere 9 months. It's so frustrating though because there were genuinely great things at the heart of Anthem. The idea of an ever-changing anthem of creation that restructured the landscape was the stuff of sci-fi dreams. The core combat and flying made you feel like goddamn Iron Man, and BioWare can write charming characters in their sleep. Sadly, it didn't work, but let's hope the studio can turn the ship around next year. Number 13, No Man's Sky. The thing about talking about games from this decade is that, unlike those from the 2000s, modern releases are not static. They can change drastically as the years wear on, through updates and expansions that can totally salvage an otherwise disappointing game. And that's exactly what happened with No Man's Sky, a title which has been spit-shine to perfection since it launched in 2016. However, this list is about the impact games had upon first release, and No Man's Sky is one of the most noteworthy disappointments ever. That's partly due to the marketing. This was a project made by less than 30 people that was condensing entire galaxies into a single game. Yet Sony, and the devs themselves admittedly, were marketing it like it was a proper AAA first-party exclusive, presenting a vision of an experience that could never be realized at the time. Number 12, Resident Evil 6. The franchise was shaken a little bit following Resident Evil 5, but nobody expected just how much of a decline Resi 6 was going to be. Before release, Capcom put hundreds of developers on the sequel in an attempt to create 3 distinct campaigns, well, 4 if you count Ada's, that would reflect different parts of Resi's heritage. Leon's was supposed to be the classic survival horror experience pioneered by 4, Chris's would double down on the rootin' tootin' action-heavy 5, and NUKEM Jake's would, well, I'm still not entirely sure what that was doing, to be honest. Wrestling, perhaps. Perhaps it was doing wrestling. Of course, in trying to please everyone, the developers ended up pleasing absolutely nobody. There were redeeming features, of course, but the game had lost its identity and was crushed under its own bloat. Number 11, Destiny. The next game from the makers of Halo was always going to be a big deal, and understandably all eyes were on what Bungie would do after their split from Microsoft. That game turned out to be Destiny, which wasn't just another first-person shooter, but the first real attempt at what we know now as a games-as-service release, an experience that meshed the blockbuster finesse of modern action games with the never-ending nature of an MMO. While their heart was in the right place, Destiny's production was infamously troubled, with warring visions about what the project should be and a last-minute rewrite causing major headaches and a launch that was plagued by controversy. Bungie pulled it off eventually, but only after a disastrous first year. Number 10, Fable 3. In one sense, you could maybe argue that every Fable game has disappointed in some way. With this series, creator Peter Molyneux always promised the world and then delivered a snow globe. But for the most part, that was accepted because Fable 1 and 2 were genuinely excellent RPGs. Sadly, the same cannot be said of Fable 3. The trilogy capper came with more pre-release ambitions than ever before, and yet the final game felt like it was actually less ambitious than the previous titles. In an attempt to appeal to a more mainstream crowd, the bulk of the game's systems were streamlined and simplified to the point where it just wasn't fun to play, and overall simply lacked the depth fans actually came for. Number 9, Star Wars Battlefront. Okay guys, cast your mind back to 2013, before the dark times, before the Empire, EA, made it abundantly clear that they had no intentions of doing the Star Wars license they just bought from Disney justice at all. That was the glorious time of optimism and hope that Star Wars Battlefront was announced in. A reboot of a popular franchise from the team in charge of the world-conquering Battlefield series seemed like a match made in heaven, but sadly a quick turnaround to maximize profits by launching alongside The Force Awakens resulted in a game that had a solid core but was clearly half-baked. Without a single-player campaign and only a smattering of weapons, maps, and customization options, Battlefront was a decent title, but one severely lacking in content. To make matters worse, it was aimed at a much more casual market than Battlefield, and that resulted in gameplay with way less depth and a more arcade-style approach to vehicles and power-ups. It was fine, but Star Wars deserves more than fine. Number 8, Mighty Number 9. At one point, Kickstarter held so much promise. It was a platform beloved creators could use to build games that fans actually wanted, funded directly by those fans, allowing a bunch of spiritual successors to classic series to be put into production. One of the biggest was Mighty Number 9, an intended successor to the classic Mega Man games made by some of the same people, which saw huge success on the platform. However, that initial hype quickly gave way to some worry, as the people behind the project constantly unveiled new funding goals and even new projects, leaving many to wonder whether they were promising too much and stretching themselves too thin. Sadly, after a few delays, the game came out and the players who backed it were not happy. The devs couldn't even get the little things right, and it was clear this wasn't going to be the Mega Man game they'd waited decades for. Number 7. Watch Dogs. When it was revealed, Ubisoft's Watch Dogs had the weight of an entire generation resting on its back. This was the first next-gen game that players saw anything of, alongside Star Wars 13, admittedly, RIP, and its stunning graphics and unique mechanical focus on hacking looked absolutely tantalizing. Fans perhaps should have been wary, considering the tech this first demo was based on wasn't even public knowledge, but it looked too good to not get swept up in the hype. Sadly, that version of the game never actually existed, and the eventual release played like an imitation of that first impression. It had some redeeming factors, but after a widely publicized graphical downgrade, a terrible story, and hacking systems that were nowhere near as dynamic as the trailers led you to believe, the release became a cautionary tale for all next-gen games to come. Number 6. Star Fox Zero. Fans waited years for a new Star Fox game, but when Zero dropped on the Wii U back in 2016, they probably wish they hadn't bothered. Despite the long wait and promises that this was going to be a true continuation of Nintendo's Underdog series, what the company delivered was a half-baked, half-finished, half-arsed mess of a shooter. The biggest issue, apart from the game being over in less than 3 hours, was the difficulty. The title essentially played itself, dumbed down so much that there was no challenge and ultimately just no fun. Throw in some poorly implemented motion controls and Star Fox Zero appealed to no one, and even die-hard fans had to fall over themselves to find reasons to praise it. Number 5. Mass Effect 3. Look, I really don't want to rag on Mass Effect 3, it brings me no joy. The game has been a punching bag since it launched back in 2012, to the point where the things it actually did well, and there were some, like the emotional highs that it hit in places, have all been overshadowed. That said, it's not without cause because, well, that ending, man, Mass Effect 3's final moments will go down in gaming history as an example of how a botched finale can tank an entire franchise, as its out-of-nowhere introduction of a godlike Starchild and choice between 3 equally unsatisfying conclusions, all of which disregarded the choices players made up until that point, left fans in total disbelief. There were other issues, of course, including streamlining, there's that word again, dialogue systems down to 2 options rather than 3, and an overabundance of fetch quests, but they'd have been accepted had BioWare's game nailed the landing. Number 4, Dead Space 3. EA is a publisher that just can't help but take something good and turn it into dirt. Dead Space was the rare new IP from the studio that managed to do something new and excel in a genre the company usually doesn't bother with, pushing the survival horror space forward at a time where Resident Evil was kind of stagnating. Of course, being hugely successful in a so-called niche genre wasn't enough for EA, and the third game was mandated to introduce co-op to be more accessible to action fans and also to feature one of the first major microtransaction systems so players could buy their way to the best weapons. As you might imagine, none of that was conducive to what Dead Space did well, which was atmospheric single-player fights to the death with monstrous necromorphs that want to eat your face off. As a result, the franchise has been on ice ever since. Number 3, CRACKDOWN 3. Rounding off the trio of terrible threequels, CRACKDOWN 3 is the ultimate example of just how much Microsoft dropped the ball with exclusives this gen. This was a title announced alongside huge promises. It was to make use of cloud technology for a fully destructible open world. It was to be the killer app for the world's most powerful console, the Xbox One X. And it was to revitalize a fan-favorite series that had long been underserved. Of course, it didn't follow through on any of those promises, and after a bunch of delays and downgrades, was just farted out in early 2019 to little fanfare. Though it was a game in development for a long time, it felt like a product made in 12 months that had been sitting on the shelf since 2010. Number 2, Duke Nukem Forever. One of the most infamous games of all time, nobody really thought that after 15 years in development, Duke Nukem Forever was actually going to be any good. And yet somehow it still failed to live up to even those tempered expectations. Players at the very least were looking forward to one more nostalgic romp with old Duke, one more chance to enjoy his crude crack and shoot some aliens in the bloody face. But what they got was the equivalent of slowly walking around a golf course with your great uncle who just can't help but talk to you about the good old days and complain about the youth of today while smelling his own farts. Jokes aimed at Halo's Master Chief, a game series that had eclipsed Duke so much in relevancy and quality by that point it wasn't even funny, made the whole thing feel a bit like that old man yells at Cloud joke from The Simpsons, only presented unironically and over 12 painful hours. Number 1, Aliens Colonial Marines. This still hurts. It might seem obvious now that Aliens Colonial Marines was always destined to be a disaster, but it didn't seem it at the time. Sure, there were a few signs before launch that things weren't right, including a whole chunk of delays, but all the footage released from the game in demos and E3 trailers looked like the authentic Aliens tie-in fans had been waiting and praying for. And in every interview, the team seemed committed to doing this franchise justice. Of course, it was all a great big bloody lie. God damn it, I hate this game. The trailers themselves were utter bullshots that didn't accurately reflect the finished product, and when reports came out that most of the production was outsourced to other companies, it became apparent that the devs didn't care half as much as they initially claimed. What was left was a complete laughingstock, a complete mess of a product, but hey, at least we have the memes, I guess. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Were these games as disappointing for you as they were for me? And are there any titles that you think should have made it on here? Either way, while you're down there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't know, I've been Josh. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.